I think the consumer advocacy is another aspect of this, where in the past, the marketing department did a lot of research on the consumer, and that informed their messaging and their brand strategy. Increasingly today, the CMO is the voice for the customer. So it's not just voice of the customer, it's voice for the customer.
Hey gang, it's Monday, January 24th. Dave and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Smartly.io. I'm Marcus, and today I'm joined by our principal analyst who heads up our marketing practice. It's Dave Frankland.
Hey Marcus, thanks for having me.
Hey chap, thanks so much for hanging out. Today's fact, or actually rather today's myth, we only use 10% of our brains. It's a myth. Many people believe that humans only use 10% of their brains. It's even the plot line for 2014 film Lucy, starring Scarlett Johansson. However, that's nothing but a myth. Neurologist Barry Gordon told Scientific American. He says that humans use virtually every part of the brain, and most of the brain is active almost all of the time. Dave, did you know this?
I didn't, and it's slightly concerning. I was hoping we had something left in reserve.
This one kills me, because I liked the idea that I'm just using 10%. I could use more if I wanted to. I could be smarter. No, I'm literally this is my ceiling.
Peak.
This is my current level of intelligence. Yeah. I hate today's one. I shouldn't have even read it out. Anyway, today's real topic, the ever-changing CMO. All right, Dave, today we are talking all about the CMO. In part because you just wrote about it, the evolving role of the CMO, how CMOs can align with the business to drive success is the title of your new report. Let's dive into it. I have to start, Dave, with what you listed as a key fact of the report. And it was a chart looking at the average CMO tenure. Chief Marketing Officer is what we're obviously talking about. And the average CMO tenure in the US fell to 3.5 years in 2020, down from 4 years in 2014. So in 6 years, it's dropped by half a year from 4 to 3.5. Why is the average CMO tenure falling?
So there could be any number of different reasons. I think in the last couple of years, we'd be foolish not to consider the pandemic has probably had an impact. But as you said, and this is research from Spencer Stewart that shows we're at the lowest point in the last decade in terms of tenure.
Yeah.
There's a whole slew of reasons. Marketers are basically, the demands on marketers are getting squeezed from all sides. When you could think about what consumers want and demand, the attention span of consumers, obviously the marketers are the primary role tasked with reaching those consumers. We're splitting our attention across a multitude of media, doing that simultaneously just makes it hard to catch people's attention. And then there's other factors. Consumers are more privacy minded. They're wary of how companies use their data. They're blocking them at times as a result. Consumer control. They decide what they want to receive, how they want to receive it, when they want to receive it. And also their expectations are going up. What they want from one company, what they receive from one company, they want that sort of experience from the next. And then there's a whole slew of external developments, political, social, that marketers have to be cognizant of, navigate in order to meet what the consumer wants while trying to sell their wares.
Yep. It's been a steady decline. Speaking about the tenure, it's not like it got to 2019 and dropped off a cliff in 2020. You know, from those 4 years, it was ticking down 2015, 2016, tiny bump in 2017, and then pretty consistent kind of staircase drops from 2017 to 2020, resting at that 3.5 years. Then in terms of CMO tenure, you mentioned just the number of demands placed on the CMO, the number of things they're having to think about. Are CMOs doing too much, in your opinion? And also on top of that, what should they cut back on / not be doing?
Yeah, so are they doing too much? I think it depends on the CMO. One of the things that became apparent through this research, so we spoke to about 35 CMOs, industry observers, university, B-school professors. And one of the things that's really clear is there is no single definition of a CMO and their responsibilities. That in itself is actually part of the problem. There's a mismatch for a lot of companies. What a CEO may think she or he wants in a CMO doesn't always match up with the person's capabilities. So for sure, the breadth of capabilities, there's a professor at Darden Business School, Kim Whitler, who wrote about just the breadth of responsibilities the CMO has versus their C-suite peers, the CFO, the CIO. and found it to be much broader than any of those other roles. The other thing is she pointed out that we didn't include in the research, there's a huge number of CMOs that don't have a marketing qualification or education. And as she said, imagine trying to hire a CFO that doesn't have a finance degree or a CIO that isn't an engineer. Wouldn't happen.
Right.
So I think, there's no single CMO sort of definition. And so what we attempted to do in the research was to sort of say, here's the breadth of responsibilities that we found common across everyone. And we identified 5 archetypes of CMO. So some of those things naturally fit together. And so the recommendation coming out of the report is for companies to get better at defining what they want from their CMO, and for the CMO to be really clear about where their skills and capabilities lie, so that they can get a better match.
Right. Well, so kind of to that point, more specifically, what types of responsibilities are landing on the shoulders of the CMO?
Yeah, so again, there's a huge breadth of responsibilities. I'll sort of break them into a few areas, some of which the CMO has owned for a long time. Some of them, the portfolio is expanding. So brand strategy is something that has forever sat with the marketing department. But increasingly now, customer engagement in the age of digital in particular falls often to the CMO. Revenue growth is increasingly one of the primary ways the CMO is being measured. They're a voice for the customer, voice of and a voice for the customer. And there's also a huge technology and data requirement sitting on the CMO in many organizations now. And as I said, it's sort of no two organizations are the same, but it's some or all of those. It's like a pick and mix of capabilities from across that CMOs are being tasked with.
So we mentioned a lot of things there. What in your mind, this can be different for everyone, but are there some general themes, recent developments, perhaps responsibilities that, in your opinion, are keeping the CMO up at night?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the sheer volume of data that companies are capturing about the consumer. And as I mentioned, sort of consumers are more privacy aware. So there's this need to balance what we know and how do I personalize and be as relevant as possible in my communication with the consumer while not creeping them out. So that whole data and technology side of things is huge. I think the consumer advocacy is another aspect of this, where in the past, the marketing department did a lot of research on the consumer and that informed their messaging and their brand strategy. Increasingly today, the CMO is the voice for the customer. So it's not just voice of the customer, it's voice for the customer inside the organization. And then, as I say, probably the third one I would mention would be the revenue side of things, where depending on the organization, increasingly the CMO is responsible for performance all the way through innovation in terms of product and other forms of innovation for the business.
Right. The last episode we did together, we talked about this role which more companies were hiring for, particularly last year, a lot of high-profile cases of companies hiring for a chief customer officer. How does the relationship between the chief customer officer and the CMO coexist, and or how are people choosing which one to kind of focus more attention on?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's part of the challenge for the CMO is they're now sitting in a C-suite that may have a multitude of other titles, that there's almost this Venn diagram of areas where, depending on the organization, there's what's owned by the CMO in one organization may be owned by somebody else in another. So you call that a perfectly appropriate one, like the chief experience or chief customer officer may own that customer advocacy in some organizations, whereas it falls to the CMO in others. Similarly, you've got the chief digital officer, the chief revenue officer, the chief brand officer in some organizations, that the CMO has to sort of fit their responsibility in the area that doesn't necessarily overlap with some of those other functions. And that's part of the challenge, right? Because again, it goes back to if the company is hiring a generic CMO who has these skills, there is a chief customer officer or a chief digital officer that has some of those responsibilities. Either you're hiring somebody and not using their skills, or you're just setting yourself up for turf wars and political fighting inside the organization.
Right. You mentioned Venn diagram. I'm thinking obviously concentric circles, thinking them basically on top of each other and you move them fractionally apart. So yeah. Pretty much 99% is overlapping. Kind of on this point, what in your opinion are the most important connections a CMO can have or has to establish? And I'm talking about connections with particular teams and or particular people, individuals in the company, to be as successful as they can be.
So I actually asked that of every interviewee. And
oh, really?
Yeah. And I would say that by far the most frequent answer was the CFO, which is a huge and positive development. You know, marketing used to be good enough for marketers to come home with a Cannes Lion award or something like that to sort of talk about how brilliant their marketing was. Today, the most advanced CMOs are having breakfast once a week with the CFO, and that's not just for nourishment and coffee, right? That's to improve the relationship, to get on the same page in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So that's first and foremost. Depending on the makeup of the business and the business model, Chief Product Officer was frequently referenced. And then again, it depends on the other titles internally. If there's a head of sales, if there's a head of digital, whatever else, it's going to depend. But probably the number one is CFO.
Okay. What would you say are some of the most, we go with the top three if you have them, the most important factors contributing to the success of a CMO?
So I think the first thing, which shouldn't sound new, but is often neglected, is for CMOs to sort of tie themselves to the strategy of the business. Okay. Again, sort of marketing has sometimes been the make it pretty department versus the drive the business department, and tying the marketing strategy to the business strategy should be job number one. A second thing, which is interesting, and it's true of any leader, but sometimes overlooked again, is the focus on leadership style. Some CMOs at the largest organization have teams in the thousands, and being that leader that is empathetic, listening to team, focusing on their needs, focusing on their development, being a great listener internally is an absolutely critical requirement, but it's also important to match with the business. If you're in a high growth business, you sort of need that entrepreneurial hacker mentality, let's get things done, versus a more established brand, for example, where it might be much more important to make sure we've got everything planned out in advance, take the steps in the right way, etc. So it's really important to match that. And then finally, as I mentioned, probably the most important thing is matching the CMO's skills with the business needs. And that is a huge disconnect in so many organizations.
Mm-hmm. And how do they align that best? Is it just a conversation?
It's a conversation and an honest analysis, both internally within the individual and internally within the company. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, we identified 5 archetypes of CMO, and basically it's sort of what skills do they bring together that are a natural fit. You have sort of a strategy-focused CMO versus a revenue-focused CMO versus a brand-focused CMO versus engagement or experience-focused. Each one of those has different sort of core skills. And as I say, then companies have different needs. And so if you are looking for a brand-focused CMO and you hire a revenue-focused CMO, that's where we think those disconnects come in. Again, Kim Whitler at Darden has done some phenomenal academic research on this that highlights those disconnects and doesn't have the same archetypes that we identified, but talks about the mismatch in an academic way of the disconnect between companies and CMOs.
Okay. Final bonus question for you. What, in your opinion, was the most interesting finding from all of your research on the CMO?
Well, I think that need for alignment is probably the most significant finding.
Was there one that you were doing the homework for this and someone said something to you, or you found a piece of data and you said, oh, wow, maybe this isn't the most groundbreaking thing. It's not the thing that most people are talking about, but something you weren't expecting?
So I think, probably the differences of opinion as it relates to what's known as brand standing. So companies aligning with issues that are important to their buyer. And it's almost equally divided between those that think it's important for brands to take a stand and those that don't want brands to take a stand. So going back to your early question about the challenges facing the CMO, it's really hard to please all of the people all of the time. And so that would probably be one of the things I'd point to.
Terrific. Well, that's it for the lead story. Time now for the halftime report. So Dave, take a takeaway or two from you, if I may, from the first half.
Sure. So I think the biggest takeaways would probably be the conclusions, right? So in terms of the importance of aligning with the strategy of the business, aligning your leadership style to the need of your team and the scope of the business, and most importantly, aligning the skills and preferences of the CMO with the needs and requirements of the business.
Well, the report's called The Evolving Role of the CMO, How CMOs Can Align with the Business to Drive Success. Couldn't be more hot off the press. It came out last Wednesday, so go check that out if you're a pro subscriber. That's all we've got time for the lead. Time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, Smartly.io. Hi to all the social media marketers out there. Listen up. Social platforms have become more important than ever for brands. You know this. So if you're looking to scale your social advertising in 2022, look no further. Smartly.io is number one in social media advertising. They help brands automate every step of the process by combining creative production and ad buying to unlock greater performance. To get the brand new 2022 social advertising trends report, go to smartly.io/eMarketer. All right, folks, we are back today in other news. Is the customer always right? And how best to capture the attention of B2B audiences? Story 1. A nation on hold wants to speak with a manager. In our anger-filled age, when people need to shop or travel or cope with mild disappointment, they are devolving into children, writes Sarah Lyle of the New York Times. She points out that during an uncertain time, especially with Omicron, things feel broken. Companies keep postponing back to the office dates. The CDC keeps changing its rules. Political discord has calcified into political hatred. People seem to resent having to interact with strangers more than normal. According to a recent survey from communications company Weber Shandwick, only 40% of people believe that America's tone was civil. The meanness of the public, she writes, has forced many public-facing industries to rethink what used to be an article of faith, that the customer is always right. So my question here to you, Dave, is the old adage of the customer is always right is blank. And you're the perfect person to talk about this with because you've actually written a book about the entitled consumer.
So the adage is both right and wrong.
Okay. Okay. What do you got?
So before I answer directly, what I would say is my son is learning to drive right now. Okay. And he's very carefully paying attention to who has the right of way when he gets to intersections and when he does this, that, and the other. And one of
who knows? Stop signs. Right? Who bloody knows?
Well, you live in Texas.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't help.
The one thing that he hasn't been able to get his head around is that the pedestrian always has the right of way, even when they don't. Similarly, the customer is always right, even when they're not. Customers is less right today than they've ever been, but they're more empowered today than they've ever been. So they have the power to flame a company on social media, to take their business elsewhere, to do any number of different things. And a company has less control of that message than they've ever had in the past. So that entitled consumer is also an empowered consumer that can go elsewhere.
You wrote about this specifically in a book. What's the name of that book?
Marketing to the Entitled Consumer.
Okay. People can check that out where? Where do books live?
All good bookstores. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore. May not still have it, but they can order it.
Perfect. But on stop signs, they are the worst thing. I love a good roundabout.
I'm with you.
So much safer.
That's what happens when we grow up in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. We do things the right way. I'm looking at you, America. Story 2. 3/4 of marketers say that capturing the attention of B2B audiences is harder than it was a year ago, according to research from independent design consultancy, The Frameworks, which surveyed 150 B2B marketers at companies of over 500 people. The majority of respondents pointing to a lack of budget, playing things safe, and heightened competition as the main reasons. A recent Adweek piece written by Alex Rin, a senior content marketing manager at LinkedIn, answers 7 questions about reaching and engaging B2B decision makers, from how the pandemic affected them to how B2B buying teams are changing to what content works best. Dave, the most important question answered by this article about reaching and engaging with B2B decision makers was blank.
Was the most important qualities of content. My reason for saying that is I thought it was fascinating that they called out 62% of respondents saying that a vendor, the most important content was that made it easier to build a business case for the purchase. And I think that that's really interesting and accurate, but I think it's for the marketer, it's really important to match the content to the stage of purchase. Making that business case as somebody who's already probably decided that they have a need and they're trying to make that case to others. There's a very different form of content required when I'm trying to understand how do I solve a need. And so making sure you have different types of content available in different ways that meet the person where they have the need is probably the most important thing any marketer, but especially a B2B marketer, can do.
And that is all we have time for. Thanks so much, Dave, for hanging out today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks to Victoria. She edits the show. And thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily and eMarketer podcast made possible by Smartly.io.